Welcome back. Now, last night, the administration of the United States said that President Donald Trump announced the Saudi Arabian investment of 600 billion US dollars in the US, including through technology partnerships and a weapon sales agreement worth 142 billion US dollars. This comes as Donald Trump continues his Middle Eastern tour, which of course concluded with a trip to Bahrain. He, of course, met with Syria and its new leader, Ahmed al-Shara. Now, this comes at a time when the ceasefire in Gaza and the question over it has an even bigger question mark than it had before. And this, of course, still happens with the genocide occurring and deaths occurring in a massive scale. Joining me now to discuss this, I'd like to welcome no stranger to Hilaal TV, Jeenah, who is the director of the Afro-Middle East Center. Naeem, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Naeem, there's an AI video of Donald Trump riding a few camels with gold, and it's a whole lot of camels. There's even someone that mentioned that he was Aladdin who went to the Arabian desert, found the lamp, and brought back all the riches. It's a clear case of that, isn't it? He's come out the winner, and it just feels that the Arab nations have supposedly succumbed to most of his demands.
I'm not sure it's as simplistic as that for us. I mean, sure, we've got $600 billion worth of investment by Saudi Arabia in the United States, of which, as you point out, about 142 million of it is mostly weapons sales. So there is that. There's other kinds of financial deals that have been and are being made. He's in Qatar today and thereafter the UAE, where more such deals will be made. But I think that the mood is a bit different than it was a few years ago. You might remember one of the first trips that Trump made in his first term as president was also to Saudi Arabia, where he had this big extravagant gathering with all these heads of states, etc. This time the mood is quite different. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, for example, the group of business people that was with Trump, they were talking not only about Saudi investments in the US, but also US investments in Saudi Arabia. So there's that. There's also the kind of new regional and global environment. At a regional level, unlike the last time, Trump is not visiting a country that is in a cold war with Iran. He's visiting a country that actually in the recent past has been quite friendly towards Iran. A country about which the Iranians on Sunday, in their negotiations with the Americans on the nuclear deal, suggested that perhaps uranium enrichment Iran could be doing together with other Arab states. Primarily, of course, Saudi Arabia. So at a regional level, it's a very different place. At a global level, Saudi Arabia is no longer the kind of uncritical proxy, if you like, of the United States that it previously was. It now plays the field. It has relations with Russia. It purchases weapons from Russia. It has relations with China, which it convinced to broker a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran a couple of years ago. So Saudi Arabia itself has these discussions with the Trump delegation from a point where it has more leverage than it did in the past. So it's not as simplistic as that. Also, you might remember that Trump's big thing in the past was his Abraham Accords. Yes. Which he did mention in his speech yesterday, but the Saudis had made it clear before the visit that they would not entertain that issue in the meeting that he had with Mohammed bin Salman, because Saudi Arabia is not interested in talking about normalization with Israel at this stage. So yeah, in many ways the mood is kind of different from what it was previously. And these countries in the region have come to a conclusion. Many of them, not all of them, of course, many of them have come to a conclusion that that their regional stability is much more important than their relations with the United States or with the West.
Naeem, I want to touch on especially Saudi Arabia and Qatar playing this role of being the broker, of being this nations, the respective nations that would be there to sit down and try and broker peace between two warring parties. Qatar, of course, played that, tried to play that, of course, in the current civil war in Sudan. Saudi Arabia has tried to play that with, of course, the brokering of a supposed ceasefire deal between Russia and Ukraine. And juxtapose that to, of course, what we saw 8 or 7 years ago. You're right in saying, of course, that the playing field now is quite different. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are now seen from a global perspective as nations that are willing to be this brokering mediator to make sure that the stability and peace across the world.
Yes and no. I mean, I say no because certainly for Qatar, this is not a new thing. Qatar prides itself, and I mean, part of its soft power, if you like, is this brokering role that it's able to play. You know, the war in Darfur, not now, but previously,
Sure.
That was resolved through Qatari mediation. That took, you know, a couple of years. The withdrawal of the Americans from Afghanistan, brokered by Qatar with a Taliban delegation that was given an office and based in Doha for a couple of years. So Qatar has been playing that role for a long time. Saudi Arabia, a little new to it, but not completely new. I mean, they certainly on the Palestinian issue, they tried to come to some agreement among the Arab states. But another country that we often don't think about in this regard, which is as important or not, if not more important, in this regard than Qatar, is Oman.
Yes.
The first Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, came about as a result of very quiet and secret mediation by Oman between the US and Iran until they were ready to make it public, and then it became public and Oman stepped back. This time around, these negotiations are publicly, overtly being done by Oman, not secretly, between the US and Iran. The deal with Ansar Allah in Yemen, the ceasefire deal between it and the United States, was brokered by Oman. So Oman has been playing this kind of role for a long time as well, and mostly very quietly behind the scenes until it's ready to make it public. So this kind of thing, I think, is an important role that some of these countries play. What Saudi Arabia has attempted, not with any great deal of success, but has attempted between Russia and the US, is new in some respects, because you're looking at it trying to mediate between two essentially global powers, while the other mediations we're talking about are either with the global power and a smaller regional power, or with local disputes like in Sudan, etc. So yes, there's a new dimension to that, but I think we shouldn't think that this is something new. It is, however, for all of these three countries, it's a way in which they establish their credentials as important role players globally.
Naeem, I want to turn to Syria because this has been one that I think a lot of people have been keeping a keen eye on. Of course, Trump met Ahmed al-Shara, the Syrian leader. This, of course, a few hours before that, the United States lifting the sanctions on Syria. What's your analysis with regards to a potential US-Syria relationship being developed?
Look, I think Trump is the fact that he announced yesterday the lifting of the sanctions, which, by the way, these sanctions go back to 1979. So it's quite a significant thing. And it's also very important because for Syria, there's no possibility of a movement forward in terms of reconstruction, its economy, etc., unless sanctions are lifted. Exactly what the details of that lifting is, we unsure. We'll wait to find out. But Trump is indicating by that and by meeting Shara today. And by the way, he's still regarded, he's still on the terrorism list in the US. So it's a big thing for the president of the US to meet with a terrorist from their perspective. But the indication is that the US wants to build relations with Syria. From Syria's perspective, this yesterday's announcement and today are extremely important. As I said, there's no possibility of its economy improving, of it being able to attract investment, of it being able to reconstruct the country. And it's a country that has been massively destroyed, half of its population displaced, about half of that half outside the country, and the other part within the country internally displaced, and requires massive investment in order just to normalize the lives of people. So the lifting of sanctions is a massive thing, and that's why people in Damascus, in Syria yesterday, were celebrating on the streets because they realize what this means for the economy, for their livelihoods as individuals. So for Syria, this has been very important. I think we should be cautious how we look at it. Certainly, from the United States perspective, they would want to use the lifting of the sanctions to exert influence on Syria. They recognize that Syria is an important player, and potentially even more important than it has been in the region as a whole. And to be able to exercise some influence on that would be useful. Reportedly, in the meeting between the two, Trump suggested to Sharad that Syria normalizes relations with Israel, which is a bit of a laugh because he didn't say the same to Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have normalized relations with Israel. He's not going to say the same to Qatar either. So it was, I don't think we should place too much of store on that. I think that the Syrian government has massive challenges. Yes.
I have to stop you there. Unfortunately, we have to go to a break. We're going to continue this conversation, but of course, we're going to be touching on Israel's role in all of this. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm still in conversation with Naeem Jeenah, director of the Afro-Middle East Center. Naeem, apologies for cutting you there, but I have to get to this over here. So when listening to the analysts, both from the US and Israel, they say that Trump not visiting Netanyahu seems to be some sort of distancing between the two. Maybe the relationship is strained there. The US is not visiting Israel, who is, of course, its most key and important ally. Is Netanyahu annoyed right now, given that you saw the release of Eden Alexander, the American-Israeli a soldier by Hamas? Hamas says that the negotiations were done directly with US officials. Saudi Arabia is saying we will not go ahead and normalize any ties with Israel until there's some sort of solution with regards to Palestine, not just the ceasefire, but of course the recognition of its statehood. And you spoke about Syria, of course, and one of its pushing for it to have some sort of normalizations with Israel. Is Netanyahu annoyed right now, or is this just something that he's a waiting game with regards to him?
Netanyahu is massively annoyed and frustrated and angry. It's this trip is the kind of, in a sense, the cherry on the top. Being snubbed by a United States president, visiting the region and not visiting Israel is a huge thing. Looking at all American presidents going back decades from today, and Trump was clear from the beginning that he's not going to. But I say it's a cherry on the top because it follows a number of other developments in the past 2 months. That's all. By the way, Trump's been in office for just 3 months. So it was Netanyahu believing, I think sincerely believing, that he was going to corral the United States into a war with Iran and then destroy Iran, not only its nuclear capacity, but the country as a whole. Instead of that happening, Trump opened negotiations with Iran without telling the Israelis. And then Netanyahu publicly said that these negotiations will result in, or the Americans are demanding that Iran not have any nuclear program at all, not even a civilian program, that they should buy the enriched uranium from outside, that the discussions also include curbs on Iran's ballistic missile and other missiles programs, curb on its support for what they call its proxies in the region, etc. And immediately after that, Trump says, as long as the Iranians agree not to have a nuclear weapons program, we're fine. Then there was the issue with Ansarullah in Yemen. Again, Netanyahu believing that with the Americans starting to bomb Ansarullah, he had them on board, going to wipe out Ansarullah. After a week, they announced that they're having a ceasefire. And the ceasefire from the Ansarullah side is not that they're stopping any attacks on shipping, it's that they're stopping attacks on American ships. The attacks on other ships going to Israel continue. The attacks on Ben Gurion Airport continue, and Trump has said nothing about that. Then the deal about this soldier, Eden Alexander, the American-Israeli soldier. This was the second time, you will recall, that the U.S. has had direct negotiations, direct talks with Hamas. Again, Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization in the US. The US has a policy that they will not negotiate with terrorists. But the first time was with this envoy Buller, who you might remember made the statement about how Hamas are nice guys who are reasonable and can be talked to, etc. And this time around, without any leaks, because the last time it was scuttled by the Israelis, without any leaks, they reached a deal. A deal in which Hamas basically said, this is a goodwill gesture, we're releasing the guy and we're not getting anything in return. A massive slap in the face for Netanyahu. He made it sound as if it was a collaborative thing between him and the US, but clearly it wasn't. So yeah, Netanyahu is not in a very happy situation right now, and he was able to also use this card with the Israeli public to say, I have the president's ear, the ear of the US president, and he'll do whatever I want to be done, and clearly that's not the case.
Naeem, the genocide continues. Israel continues to maintain its bombardment. The ceasefire negotiations, the ceasefire deal, clearly, when listening to Stephen Witkoff, the envoy to the Middle East from the US, they want something to happen. Of course, more of it leaning towards the release of the hostages. If Netanyahu doesn't play ball now, and it's quite clear, I think the world knows quite clearly who Israel are. They know who clearly the Israeli government is for, of course, reneging on that ceasefire deal back in March. If they don't get a deal done from their side, because it's quite clear Hamas wants to come to the party, then this further deepens any supposed position that Netanyahu had that they are the quote-unquote victims in all of this. This changes the whole narrative, doesn't it?
Well, I think that narrative has changed. I think I don't know that anyone in the world really believes that anymore. The whole world is able to see the genocide taking place, the violations of international law, the bombing of hospitals again last night, the statement by the envoy to the UN or rapporteur to the UN yesterday, damning statement about Israel. I think the world knows. You have the French president making an outrageous statement. I mean, whether it's going to happen or not, but the fact that he makes the statement that if aid is not allowed through, then we will send our soldiers to ensure that aid gets through. I mean, it's a shocking kind of statement to be made. So the world knows what is going on. The issue now is whether the world is going to step up and do anything. in the kind of way that Macron said
mm,
should be done, or is it going to continue maintaining this silence, acquiescence, and therefore complicity with the genocide? From Netanyahu's perspective, he wants this so-called war
mm,
to last as long as possible. Because the longer it lasts, the longer he can strengthen his ruling coalition and remain in power, and the longer he remains in power, the more delayed is his day in court, where he can get convicted for corruption and all of that. So there's a personal and a political objective here for him to continue murdering Palestinian babies. I mean, it's as simple as that. So he'll do whatever is necessary. On the negotiations thing, it does seem like the Americans are getting a little jittery
mm,
about the Israelis not playing ball, and the fact that the Israelis have gone back to the table now, despite the genocide, continuing with intensity in Gaza. The fact that they got back to the table is, I think, because of American pressure to make that happen. There's also the kind of hint that has been coming from the White House that if a deal is reached, a ceasefire deal is reached while Trump is in the region, then he might pop over to Israel and pay a visit.
mm.
I don't know that a deal can be reached by tomorrow, but the indication here is that Netanyahu is using a bit of a carrot and stick approach. Now, where is his heart in it? Does he like Palestinians? No, none of that is true. He's really concerned about his own interests and the interests of the United States of America, but right now that might prove to be a little bit useful, at least.
Now, I've got 2 minutes. Given from on face value, and of course we can debate this whether this is true or not, how Trump has conducted himself during this Middle Eastern visit. President Cyril Ramaphosa is about to, of course, make a working visit to the United States. Given this whole comments about a quote-unquote white genocide, we saw the 49 Afrikaner farmers moving to the United States, the expelling of Ibrahim Rasool as the ambassador. Can President Ramaphosa go in knowing that he has a reasonable US president to work with, or are we just having a sort of pie in the sky moment? 2 minutes, Naeem.
Look, no one really believes that Trump is the reasonable United States president or a predictable president or predictable person for that matter. So I don't know. So the question is not whether President Ramaphosa has a reasonable interlocutor. The question is whether he has a reasonable chance to convince his interlocutor about a few things. And on that question, I think the answer is yes. I think there's a few things about Trump. One is that he can be charmed, and what we know about Ramaphosa is that he can be charming. Secondly, that Trump's kind of tradition, he would often make outrageous statements and then sit down in a one-on-one meeting with the person and come out of that meeting with an entirely different opinion than the one he went in with. We know that with Zelensky and him meeting in Rome, for example, he came out, virtually a cheerleader of Zelensky, but just a few days before, he berated Zelensky in the Oval Office. So the opportunity of a one-on-one meeting between Ramaphosa and Trump, I think, can only be good for South Africa. It'll give Ramaphosa the opportunity as president, not envoy, not ambassador, but as president to do his charming bit, to put forward the case for South Africa, and make a good argument. Let me end on this, that if you remember the executive order that Trump issued about South Africa, there were two reasons he gave for why he was issuing that. The second one was the ICJ case. The first one was this idea of terrible things happening in South Africa with the property of white people being taken away. Ramaphosa could say, look, on the ICJ issue, we stuck in this thing. We can't go anywhere. So let's forget about that. But on the first issue, I can give you a guarantee that no white property has been taken over, and we have no plans to do so. I guarantee you we're not going to do any such thing. That the tone of that meeting could change. So I think that there's possibility for something good to come out of that meeting next week.
Naeem, always a pleasure having you on. Jazakallah so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa
That's
barakatuh.
Naeem Jeenah, the director for the Center of Afro-Middle East. Always a good conversation to have with him. And of course, we will see how the final conclusion of this trip with Donald Trump to the Middle East will be occurring. But what everyone is hoping is that at least by the end of the week, if there could be some sort of deal of a ceasefire, inshallah, that will help the people of Gaza. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Jazakallah so much for joining us on Talking Point. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.